Montana Territory, spring of 1878. The wind off the Bitterroot Mountains carried the smell of wet pine and distant snow, and Rosalind Porter was being sold like cattle at a trading post just outside Missoula. She stood stiff near the back of a wagon, dress wrinkled from days of travel, her wrists red from ropes that had been cut only minutes ago. Her father, drunk, broke, and desperate, had traded her to settle a gambling debt. She was 20 years old, her mother long buried, and there was no one left in the world to stop it. "He's a rich rancher," her father had slurred, stumbling as he handed over her travel bag to a stranger with a crooked hat and yellow teeth. "You'll be taken care of." The man who'd bought her, Clayton Hargreaves, was older, maybe 40, with a thick gut and a voice like gravel. He eyed her like she was a mule he planned to break. Rosalind didn't cry. She hadn't in days. Not since her father lost the last of their land and told her she had to make up for his bad luck. She just stared past Clayton, jaw tight, heart pounding. "You got fire," he said, grabbing her arm. "But you'll learn." Before she could answer, a voice cut through the crowd. "Let her go." Rosalind turned. A tall man in a weathered coat and wide-brimmed hat stood at the hitching post, his hand resting on the butt of a Colt at his hip. His horse twitched beneath him, sensing the tension in his body. He looked younger than Clayton, maybe in his late 20s. Dust streaked his boots and coat, and the sun had browned his skin to something warm and honest. "She ain't yours to speak on," Clayton growled. "She is now," the cowboy answered. "Name's Oakley Dawson, and I'm calling this deal off." Rosalind blinked. The stranger's eyes were locked on hers. There was no pity in them, just something steadier. Like he'd already made a choice and didn't plan on backing down. Clayton let out a laugh. "You got $10,000 to buy her off." "No," Oakley said, swinging down from his saddle. "But I got a rifle, a fast horse, and no fear of you." He stepped between Rosalind and her would-be purchaser, and for the first time in days she felt air in her lungs. "I ain't letting you take her," Oakley said again. "She ain't property." Clayton's hand hovered near his holster. "You really want to shoot over a girl you never met?" Oakley did not flinch. "No, I want to marry her." Rosalind's heart stopped. "I'll give her my name right here in front of God and the whole damn town," Oakley said. "And if she says yes, you got no claim." People had started to gather, drawn by the shouting. A few ranchers, a freighter, a woman with a basket of eggs. No one moved, no one spoke. Rosalind looked at Oakley. She didn't know him, but she knew Clayton. And she knew what he would do to her once they left this place. Oakley turned to her. "I know this is fast, but I ain't letting you go with him, not if you do not want to." Her throat was tight. "You do not even know me." "I know you do not deserve to be sold." Clayton scoffed. "This is nonsense." Rosalind met Oakley's eyes. There was something quiet in him, not a rescuer, not a hero, just a man who saw wrong and stepped between it. That was enough. "I will marry you," she said. Oakley nodded once, then turned to the old preacher who ran the trading post store. "You still carry a Bible, always," the preacher said, already stepping forward. It was over in 10 minutes. Rosalind spoke her vows with a shaking voice, Oakley with a steady one. When it was done, he slid a simple silver ring onto her finger. It was scuffed and worn, like it had been in his pocket a long time. Clayton cursed, spat in the dirt, and stormed off. No one stopped him. No one followed. "I do not expect anything from you," Oakley said, once they were alone behind the stable, the wedding crowd drifting away. "You do not owe me a thing." "You gave me your name," she whispered. He shrugged. "Names are easy." She looked down at the ring. "Still, thank you." Oakley tied his horse, then reached for her bag. "Come on. I got a place west of here near the river. It is small, but safe." Rosalind hesitated, then followed. They rode in silence for most of the afternoon, the mountains rising on the horizon, the sun warm on her back. She watched Oakley from the corner of her eye. He rode like he belonged in the saddle, his body easy, his eyes always scanning the trail ahead. When they reached a low, wooden cabin tucked between pines, she felt something shift inside her. It was not much, just a roof, a porch, and a smokehouse out back, but it was still more than she had expected. "You live here alone?" she asked, stepping down from the horse he had let her ride. "Always have." He led her inside. The cabin was clean, sparse. A stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed with folded quilts. On the shelf, a small carved horse. On the wall, a faded photograph of a man and woman. His parents, maybe. "I will sleep on the floor," Oakley said, pulling a blanket from the chest. "You can have the bed." "You do not have to, I want to," he said, not meeting her eyes. That night, Rosalind sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker over Oakley's face as he mended a strap on his saddle. He did not speak much, just worked with quiet hands. "You could have walked away," she said softly. "I did not want to." She looked down at her hands. "You do not even know what kind of person I am." He looked up. "I will find out," she smiled, just barely. "You always this sure about things?" "No," he said. "But I am sure about you." It was not love yet. Not fully, but something had started out there in the wild quiet of Montana, under a roof that felt more like a promise than a shelter. Rosalind Porter and Oakley Dawson had chosen each other. Fast, reckless, and strange, but real. And sometimes real was enough to begin with. The next morning, Rosalind woke to the sound of a hatchet splitting wood. Pale light filtered through the chinks in the log walls, and the scent of pine smoke clung to the air. She sat up slowly, her body still stiff from days spent in that wagon, but her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. The bed was warm. Oakley's blanket still lay neatly folded beside the hearth. She stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight against the chill. Oakley stood by a pile of fresh-cut logs, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked over when he heard the door, but didn't stop his work. "Coffee's on the stove," he said, nodding toward the cabin. She hesitated. "Do you always work before sun up?" He lifted another log, set it on the stump, and brought the axe down clean. "It's when the day's still honest." She didn't ask what that meant. Instead, she went back inside and poured herself a cup. The enamel mug was chipped at the rim, but the coffee was hot and strong. She held it with both hands, letting the warmth settle her. When Oakley came in, he wiped his hands on a rag and poured his own cup. "You hungry?" he asked. "I could eat." He pulled a tin of flour from the shelf and lit the stove again. She watched him work, quiet and efficient, like he'd done it 100 times. After a while, she stepped beside him and reached for the bowl. "I can help," she said. He didn't argue, just handed her the spoon. Together, they stirred and poured and fried until the cabin filled with the scent of cornmeal and bacon. They ate at the small table, knees almost touching, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable. "You always live this far out?" she asked, breaking a piece of cornbread. "Since I was 17. She glanced at the photograph on the wall. "Family, they're buried up near Elk Creek. Fever took him the same winter." He didn't look away from his plate. "After that I stayed, built this place from what they left." She didn't press. She knew enough of loss not to dig too deep. When the dishes were done, Oakley hitched the wagon and brought it around front. "Need to get you some proper things," he said. "You've only got what you came with, and most of it's torn." She touched the sleeve of her dress, where the seam had split near the shoulder. "I'm not used to anyone worrying over that." "Well," he said, climbing up, "you're married to someone who does." They rode into town under a sky feathered with clouds. The general store sat quiet except for a pair of boys sweeping dust from the porch. Inside, Oakley waited near the doorway while Rosalind moved down the aisles, fingers grazing bolts of fabric, a bar of lye soap, a pair of gloves that actually fit. She paused at a mirror, eyes catching on her reflection, cheeks worn from travel, hair tied back in a rush. But there was something different now. Not softer, just steadier. "You should get what you need," Oakley said from behind her, voice low. "I don't want you spending what you can't. I've got enough for the things that matter." She nodded once, then picked out a new dress, plain blue cotton, strong stitching, functional. She added a comb and a small tin of salve for her cracked hands. He didn't question any of it. "On the ride back," she asked, "what do you do out here?" "Besides cut wood and save strangers from being sold," he gave her a sideways glance. "Raise cattle when the season's right, hunt when it ain't. Sometimes I trade pelts or help neighbors run fence." She could tell he wasn't one to boast, but there was a steadiness in the way he spoke. Like he always did what needed doing, no more, no less. When they reached the cabin again, the sun had already begun to drop behind the trees. Rosalind carried her parcel inside and unpacked slowly, folding the dress over the edge of the bed. Oakley stoked the fire one last time, then leaned against the mantel. "You don't have to stay," he said after a while. "Just 'cause the law says you're my wife. If you want to leave, I won't stop you." She turned toward him, heart thudding. "And go where? I've got no home left, no kin. You think I'll do better out there alone?" "I don't think anything," he answered. "I just want you to choose." She studied him for a long moment. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, no threat in them, no demand. "I stayed because I felt safe," she said. "I'll choose to stay because I feel something more than that now." He didn't answer, but his eyes met hers and held steady. That night, she sat beside him on the porch, the air cool and thick with the hum of crickets. They didn't speak much. But when he handed her a blanket and their fingers brushed just for a second, neither of them pulled away. The creek behind Oakley's cabin ran high with meltwater, swollen from the thaw that had come early that year. Rosalind stood by its edge, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, her hem lifted to avoid the mud. She watched the current pull fallen needles downstream, small brown boats spinning in slow spirals. The trees whispered above her, and the air held that faint green promise of spring not yet arrived, but near enough to believe in. Inside the cabin, Oakley was tending to a lame calf he'd brought in from the field. He hadn't asked her to help, but she'd seen the worry crease his brow when he thought she wasn't looking. She hadn't asked questions. She didn't need to. Some things you learn just by staying quiet long enough. She crouched near the water, fingers brushing the cold surface. Her reflection wavered, paler than she remembered, but steadier. There were days now when she didn't feel like she was waiting for the sky to fall. Days when she let herself wonder what it might be like to belong somewhere again. Later, she found Oakley in the lean-to behind the cabin, binding the calf's leg with strips of boiled cloth. Blood speckled his sleeve near the elbow, but his hands stayed calm. "She'll be fine," he said when he noticed her watching. "Just a bad twist." "She yours?" she asked. "Was born here last season. Her mother died during the freeze." Rosalind stepped closer. "You always raise them by hand when they're orphaned?" "I try. Some make it, some don't." She knelt beside him, careful not to crowd. "What made you keep this one?" She came out fighting. They worked side by side until the calf settled, breathing heavy but even. Oakley leaned back on his heels, flexing his fingers. The light falling through the gaps in the roof turned the dust to gold around them. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He wiped his hands on a piece of burlap. "Not since I built it. Don't you get lonely?" "I did. Before." She didn't respond right away. Not until he looked at her, eyes steady, waiting not for thanks or praise but for truth. "I never thought anyone would look at me like I had say in what came next," she said. "But you did." "I did because you do." She sat back on her heels. I ain't sure I know what I want yet." "That's all right," he said. "You got the rest of your life to figure it out." That evening, she started a letter at the table. Her pen scratched slow across the paper as she tried to find words that wouldn't sound like begging or bitterness. She didn't write to her father, there was nothing left to say there. Instead, she wrote to the woman who used to run the schoolhouse in her old town. Miss Eliza, who once gave her a book of poems and told her she had a mind worth using. She wrote about the mountains, the creek, the quiet. About the man who had given her his name without asking for anything in return. She didn't know if she'd ever send the letter, but it felt good to write something that wasn't meant to be read by anyone who would use it against her. Oakley came in from the barn just as she was folding it. He hung his coat by the door, boots leaving faint damp prints on the floorboards. "Fire's burnin' low," he said. "I'll see to it." She moved to the hearth, adding a split log and coaxing the embers back to life. The flames caught slow, then rose steady. Oakley pulled a tin box from the shelf and set it on the table. "I found this a while back," he said. "Didn't know what to do with it till now." She turned, wiping her hands on her skirt. Inside the box was a small stack of paper and a stub of graphite. Beneath it, a folded square of linen embroidered with faded thread, 2 initials stitched in a woman's careful hand. "My mother's," he said, voice lower now. "She used to sew when things were quiet." Rosalind ran her thumb over the letters. "You sure you want me to have this?" "I'm sure," he said. She didn't say thank you. The words didn't feel like enough. That night, she slept in the bed while he took the floor again. But she left the door open between them, and in the stillness before dawn, she heard his breathing across the room, slow, even, present. It wasn't love yet, but it was a place where love could live. And that was more than she'd ever expected to find. The creek thawed fully by the second week of April. Rosalind noticed it first in the way the birds returned, thrushes and waxwings flickering from branch to branch, calling soft and low through the early morning hush. She'd risen before Oakley for once, drawn outside by the pull of that sound, the hush of water no longer choked by ice. She kept walking past the trees, past the bend in the trail where the larger rocks jutted from the soil like old teeth. There was a clearing beyond, one she hadn't seen until now. It held the remains of a small garden, faded stakes marking rows, a rusted hoe sunk partway into the ground, the top of a clay jar poking from the dirt. When Oakley found her there, she was kneeling, pressing her palm flat to the soil. "You knew it was here," she said without looking up. "Used to grow potatoes and onions before the roof needed mending and the fence started leaning. I let it go." She brushed back her sleeve. "It's still good earth, feels like it's waiting." Oakley crossed his arms, weight shifting. "You thinking of planting?" "I am." He didn't answer right away. Then, "I've got seed tucked in the back of the shed, might be some that haven't gone soft." She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "I'd like to try." That afternoon she cleared the rows. Oakley brought the seed beans, corn, a few late carrots, and sat near the edge of the garden, whittling a bit of pine while she worked. He didn't offer to take over, just stayed close, glancing up now and again as she sank the seeds into the soil. "Where'd you learn to do this?" he asked after a long stretch of silence. "From a woman in North Platte. She let me sleep in her barn once in exchange for helping with her turnips. I watched her more than I worked." He turned the bit of wood in his hand, shaving a curl from the edge. "You lived rough, didn't you?" "I lived," she said. "Rough came with it." Oakley didn't ask more. She didn't offer more. But when she stood and stretched, rubbing the ache from her lower back, he was there with a tin cup of water and a clean rag to wipe her hands. That night, as the light drained from the trees, she lit a candle and unfolded the linen square he'd given her days before. The stitching was faded, but the thread still held. She ran her fingertip along the letters. "I was thinking," she said, glancing toward him, "about your mother." Oakley looked up from the bucket he was mending. "What about her? She must have been kind to sew something like this, to pass it down. She was quiet, knew how to sit still with people. Didn't fill the air if it didn't need filling." Rosalind nodded. "You're like that. She used to say folks talk too much when they're scared. Silence is a kind of truth." Rosalind smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why I trust you. You don't make promises you don't mean." He set the bucket aside. "You're not hard to trust." She stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the moon had risen, pale and steady above the trees. She leaned her forehead against the frame, eyes tracing the line of the hills beyond. "I'm not used to being seen past what I'm good for," she said. "Or what someone can get out of me." "You're not here for what I can get." She turned her head, watching him in the dim glow of the fire. "Then why did you step in?" "Something in me knew you were meant to be mine, not owned, just chosen." I didn't question it. She crossed back to him, slow, sure. "You're not afraid of much, are you?" "I'm afraid of losing what matters," he said. "I've done that before." They stood quiet, the heat from the stove soft between them. "You want this to be real?" she asked. "It already is." She reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. His fingers curled around hers, calloused and warm, holding steady. They didn't kiss then. It wasn't time. But when she sat beside him on the floor, leaning into his shoulder as he picked up the wood again, there was no distance left between them that hadn't already been crossed. And outside, under the slow-turning stars, the earth waited for what they would grow together. A late spring rain came down slow and steady, settling into the soil and softening the world. Rosalind stood just inside the open cabin door, apron damp from the laundry she'd managed to pin before the sky turned. She watched the rain bead along the porch rail, the quiet rhythm of it easing something tight inside her ribs. Behind her, Oakley set down the ledger he'd been marking and came to stand beside her. "You ever see the bitterroots in bloom?" he asked, voice low. She shook her head. "I've never been that far up." He rested a hand on the doorframe. "They'll come in soon, pink as sunrise all over the slopes. I'd like to take you." The fire crackled behind them, and the scent of ash and wet cedar moved through the open room. "I've never had a spring that felt like it was mine before," Rosalind said. Oakley's gaze didn't waver. "You do now." The next morning came clear, the clouds broken and the air washed clean. They saddled the horses after breakfast, Oakley packing a blanket roll and a parcel of bread and smoked meat. Rosalind tied her hair back with a strip of muslin and tucked her sleeves tight. They rode west, the trail narrow and rising, the wide sky opening above them with every turn. Hours passed in companionable quiet, the land unfolding beneath their horses, hooves in shades of green and gold. At a bend above the valley, Oakley slowed, pointing toward a distant slope where the first pale blooms dotted the ridge. "You see it?" she nodded, breath caught somewhere near her throat. "I didn't know anything could grow way up here. It's where the soil's thinnest they come through anyhow." They dismounted and led the horses to a patch of grass beneath a wind-bent pine. Oakley spread the blanket while Rosalind knelt among the flowers, her fingers brushing the petals with reverence. "These don't last long, do they?" she asked. "No, but they come back." He sat beside her, knees drawn up, and offered her a slice of bread. She accepted it, leaning into his shoulder as she ate. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wild sage and rain-soaked stone. "When I first came here," she said, "I didn't think I'd stay past the first thaw. I knew you would." She turned to him, searching the lines of his face. "How?" "Because you didn't run, even when you could have." She was quiet a long time, then said, "I think I wanted someone to see me and not turn away. You did that." He reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the curve of her knuckles. I've watched you every day since," he said. "Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. You move like someone who's always had to brace for the worst. I want to be the one thing you never have to guard against." She leaned in then, slow and certain, and kissed him beneath the thin blue sky. It wasn't rushed or unsure. It was the kind of kiss that came after long silences and steady hands, after days spent learning each other's pace. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. "You already are," she whispered. They rode back as the light waned, shadows stretching long across the land. That night, Rosalind unpacked the last of what she'd brought with her. A worn scrap of embroidery she'd saved from her mother's shawl. She stitched it into the corner of their quilt, thread pulling through fabric in quiet loops while Oakley read by lamplight. Weeks passed. The garden sprouted in slow, stubborn rows. The calf limped less and began to nudge Oakley's pockets for scraps of apple. Rosalind made curtains from the blue dress she'd replaced and lined the shelves with dried chamomile she picked near the creek. They built a chicken coop together, Oakley hammering while Rosalind measured and steadied the boards. One evening, Oakley brought her a small wooden box. Inside was a polished hairbrush and a silver pin shaped like a sprig of pine. He didn't say much, only watched her open it with that same quiet certainty he'd carried since the day they met. "I want you to have things that are yours," he said. "Not because you need them. Because you deserve them." She took his hand and led him to the porch, where the stars had just begun to prick through the night sky. "I don't want to keep waiting for something to go wrong," she said. "I want to live like this is ours." "It is," he said. "And it always will be." They sat together until the moon rose high, its light pooling across the land that now belonged not just to him, but to both of them. Years later, the cabin still stood, weathered and sound. Children's laughter echoed through the trees, and the garden grew wider each spring. Rosalind taught their daughter to gather wild herbs, and their son to listen for the hush before the rain. A small marker stood near the creek, carved with initials and a pine sprig, a piece of their history folded into the land. And every spring, when the bitterroots bloomed pink and brief across the hills, Oakley saddled the horses and took Rosalind to the ridge. They sat beneath the same pine, hands laced together, and watched the flowers that had once marked the beginning of everything. They never needed more than that, just the quiet, the steadiness, and each other.